The engine of evolution.
What is evolution? Evolution is the change in allele frequencies over time. Two major concepts of engines of evolutions are adaptation by natural selection and evolution without selection. In this case, is genetic drift.
Natural selection. Natural selection favors certain traits in the population which allow an individual to survive and reproduce. It is a non-random process. It is selecting traits. Natural selection acts on the level of the population at the level of the individual. Adaptation by natural selection has three requirements. One of them is the variability in the population. A second requirement is heritability. And finally, differential ability to survive and reproduce. An example of adaptation is the bees and the hornets from Japan and Europe. The image on the left represents how Japan bees have adapted from the attack of predators, which are hornets in their environment. As you can see in the picture, the bees are covering the hornets to kill it. The goal of the bees is to roast the hornets by increasing the temperature to 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Bees can survive at this high temperature, while hornets cannot. Meanwhile, on the right are bees from Europe that have not adapted the skill to fight hornets. They are defenseless against a predator if they were put in the same environment as the Japan bees. This is an example of adaptation through natural selection.
Another example of adaptation is the mimicry of katydids. In this case, the katydids camouflage themselves to look like the leaves to hide from enemies. They even have the rotten spots to resemble the holes in the leaves. This mimicry is very precise that the predators would have trouble spotting them in a small cage of vegetation and much less in the wild.
An example of complex adaptation is the complexity features of pileated woodpeckers. They have to search for food and communication. Their main food sources are insects like ants and beetles in the tree. The most remarkable features of them is the long tongue that attaches to the jawbone and goes around the nostril, head, and re-enters under the beaks. This tool could help them reach to the divot hole to find food. Another well-built and complicated part of them is the structure of the skulls that can withstand the pressure of its hemming speech into the wood. Those features are the pileated woodpecker's selection to adapt to their environment.
One evidence for natural selection in action is artificial selection, the animal and plant breeding. In this case, breeders virtually sculpted dogs to their liking, changing the shade and thickness of their coats, the size and shapes of their skeletons, and many others. There are two requirements for evolution by selection validated by success of dog breeding, and there are ample variation in color, size, shape, and behavior in ancestral lineage of dogs, and some of the variations that was produced by genetic mutations have to be inherited. Now, if artificial selection can produce diversity so quickly, it is easier to accept that the lesser diversity of wild dogs arose by natural selection, acting over a period 1,000 times longer. Darwin bred pigeons, and he described a huge variety of behaviors and appearance of different breeds. Furthermore, domestication of all wild crop plants has occurred within the last 12,000 years. Because of this, Darwin said that if people could accept artificial selection, and they had to, since the success was very obvious, then making the leap of natural selection was not so hard.
Barry Hall from the University of Rochester did an experiment on bacteria E. coli. He deleted a gene from the bacteria. That gene was very important for E. coli because it enabled bacteria to break down lactose and use it as a food source. In this experiment, Barry Hall put the bacteria in a lactose environment. In that environment, lactose was the only thing E. coli could use as the food source. Therefore, all would die eventually because they wouldn't eat. However, the interesting thing about this experiment is that bacteria soon acquired a new mutation that allowed them to weakly break down lactose. Then, after another period of time, bacteria acquired another mutation in a different gene and allowed bacteria to break down lactose a little bit better. And finally, a third mutation that allowed bacteria, E. coli, to break down lactose efficiently. This is an example of complex biochemical pathways. Natural selection plays an important role on building complexity. Also, natural selection acts on pre-existing features and never creates new traits. In the 1940s, antibiotics were introduced. At that time, many people were dying of many diseases. However, for a long time, we thought we had solved the problem to diseases. We were wrong. Natural selection was working on bacteria. Due to the fact that bacteria have short generation times, we were able to study them in more detail. Bacteria have a higher mutation risk and they often get mutated. Some mutations can be beneficial and others not. Viruses are another example of evolution. Even viruses have gotten resistant to drugs. AZT prevents replication of virus. Now, it's not effective anymore. Therefore, patients take other treatments for AIDS. However, even though many bacteria or viruses have evolved resistance to antibiotics, not all of them have, such as influenza virus, polio, and measles virus. The fact that not all organisms have acquired resistance reinforces the idea that not all things are subject to change if there isn't the right conditions like advantageous mutations or the environment. Then things won't evolve.
Selection in the wild. Selection does happen in the wild, but it cannot be witnessed in human lifetime due to some limiting factors. In microevolutionary, there are only small particles that evolve. Such small changes cannot be used as evidence to prove that natural selection is the key to this evolutionary. That is why there is more expectation in macroevolutionary that involve plants or animals. However, those species take a longer time to evolve due to their long generation times. Therefore, the fossil records allow us to see gradual change among animals and plants. Other factors that also affect this are the stable environment and simple natural selection. Compared to the new era, when everything started to form on Earth, the environment has become stable and doesn't have much change, so it's hard to see adaptation by natural selection. If there is any change happening, most of them are very simple and it cannot be considered if it is really due to selection. To be able to proceed selection in nature, we will need to observe species that have short reproduction time and putting them into the new environment to prevent random and uncontrollable factors that affects evolution. As we can see, food is a very strong selective force that species change due to selection. An example indicates that is the berry bugs. It is a host-specific insect that's used to live on soft berry bush and perennial balloon vine. They could use their long needle-like beaks to suck up the seeds of the plants they live in. However, for the last 50 years, they have immigrated to 3 other plants. These plants produce different kinds of seeds, and unlike the original host plants, 2 of the plants are hard seed and the others is soft seeds. Therefore, the bugs began to be distinguishing in big size that's compatible to specific host plants. This has created a form of selection in the wild. Can selection build complexity? Can selection build complexity feature for all existing creatures, or is there a touch of intelligent design? Since fluctuation takes time to evolve, we cannot observe selection work within human lifetime, and we weren't there when everything created to see whether or not selection generates everything. However, evolution of birds from dinosaurs observed through the fossil prove that natural selection happened in the nature, and new species do not form by itself. Therefore, even though some people believe in the work of intelligent design, the fossil records show that natural selection involved in adaptation. But evolution does not fully depend on natural selection due to genetic drift that take place in each individual.
Evolution without selection. Evolutionary change is not only caused by natural selection. According to most biologists nowadays, evolution is the change in proportion of alleles in a population. In the case of evolution without selection, new mutations may enter proportion of different alleles in small populations and result in the rise or fall of frequency of alleles due to the random sampling. This circumstance where frequency of genes changes randomly over time is called genetic drift. One of the examples is shown in the unusual frequencies of blood types in Old Order Amish and Dunker religious communities in the US. There are small isolated religious groups whose members intermarry, and their intermarriages show rapid evolution by genetic drift. Genetic drift versus natural selection. They are opposite to each other. Genetic drift is a random process, and it can change the frequencies of alleles regardless of how useful they are to the species. On the other hand, natural selection is not random. It always gets rid of harmful alleles and raises the frequencies of beneficial ones. One important point to take from this section is that genetic drift is powerless to create adaptations, but it can actually overpower natural selections. In small populations especially, the sampling effect can be really huge that it raises the frequencies of harmful genes even though selection is working in the opposite direction. A high incidence of genetically based diseases in isolated human communities such as Gaucher's disease in northern Sweden, Tay-Sachs, and retinitis pigmentosa are examples of genetic drift overpowering natural selection.